so theology, because I'm fascinated by particularly the early Christian period, but then so, if you don't mind me asking, or do you consider yourself a Christian or an atheist?
I don't know. I suppose when I was an undergraduate, I was actually known as Atheist Ed. I was a screaming atheist. That was the I'm a contrarian, and if I'm surrounded by religious people, which I was at school, and even at primary school, that they have. I mean, it's changed now, but back in the 80s, you had assembly and it would have prayers in it and things like this, and hymn singing and all this kind of stuff. And so the rebellion becomes being an atheist, and so that's what And at university, the power of wokeness hadn't really hit in yet. We were in a situation where the power of Christianity and that conservative traditional society was clearly in decline, but it wasn't in decline enough that it wasn't yet. It was still evident, and there was a fundamentalist Christian student group called DICU, Durham Intercollegiate Christian Union. They have them at all. They have the Oxford, Cambridge, all kinds of places. This group, and about a third of the people on my corridor 15 in my first year were members of this.
Fundamentalists.
Well, I mean, to varying degrees, yeah. I mean, a lot of them, didn't believe in evolution, for example. So I remember this one girl. She was doing her father was a doctor. She was doing a degree in biology, but didn't believe in evolution. And there were others were even more extreme. Like they didn't believe in dinosaurs. There was this one girl that thought that dinosaur bones they'd been put there by the devil. The world was created old. They'd been put there by the devil to confuse the non-believer. So this was fascinating to me. This was a whole new. There were two new cultures that I came to grips with when I was an undergraduate. One was the English upper class. That whole culture of people that had been to private school, and particularly public school. I mean, they even dressed differently. They'd wear these sort of, I don't know what you call them, but these tops with no sleeves or whatever, puffer jackets, and their collars would be up. And there was a specific look to them and a sort of culture. Once I was asked by one, do you want to come hunting, Ed? Do you want to come hunting and kill some of God's creatures? And being a sort of lower middle class, I was like, well, I think it's a bit cruel. No, not really. And so there was that culture, and then there was the Christian culture, and I have to say that they were, although I was always needling them about what I regarded as their completely irrational belief in God or in biblical literalism or whatever, they were actually extremely nice, for the most part, extremely nice, kind people, and became some of my best friends actually, and in fact one of the only people in fact with whom I'm still in touch from when I was an undergraduate 25 years ago are fundamentalist Christians or ex-fundamentalist Christians. So am I a Christian? That's a bit of a long-winded answer. The honest answer is I believe in God sometimes. Which is what makes sense in terms of evolutionary psychology, that belief in God is associated with stress, is associated with feeling excluded, and it's associated with mortality salience, i.e. awareness of death.
Yeah.
And so in those circumstances, I think most people believe in God. There are no atheists in foxholes. There were no atheists when you were being shot at by the Germans in the war, as my granddad explained to me. So that's the answer.
Very interesting. Yeah, I would like to have done some actual theology, because it's one of those things I sort of passed by. I studied the early Christian period or late antiquity, but not actually theology. There's a great long section in Gibbon all about the earliest theologies and all the earliest schisms and things. But I would have liked to have done it in more detail. But then you went on to do anthropology, right?
Well, yeah.
Would you describe yourself as an anthropologist first and foremost?
Well, not really. Not these days. I would say evolutionary psychologist, I suppose.
Right, okay.
I didn't know what I was finishing my degree, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I looked into doing a master's degree by research, and then one of the universities that I got into, Aberdeen, they basically offered some funding, which the other one I got into, Edinburgh, didn't. And he had this idea, my postgraduate supervisor, that it was such a good idea for a thesis that actually it could be like a doctoral thesis. And so it was suggested, and you could do that in those days, you can't anymore, that I just go straight from a BA to a PhD. So I started, and so that's what I then went to the University of Aberdeen to do in the divinity department there, to do a PhD in the study of religion, and it was an anthropological analysis. He was a fieldwork type guy, my doctoral supervisor, and it was an anthropological analysis of these fundamentalist Christian student groups that I'd found so fascinating as an undergraduate. So that's what I did. So I sort of I studied 3 of them, and I just would go to all their meetings and all their social stuff and everything they did, and then just make detailed notes and interview them and things like this, and then write about it. I mean, the Aberdeen University Christian Union, they even had Christian football, but on Saturdays. But the difference with Christian football and normal football is that in normal football, when it's half time, the person that's your captain or whatever in charge of your team, gives you a bollocking or encourages you. But at their half time, you pray, and you pray that God guides your foot to ensure that the ball doth enter the net. So there's this whole separate culture where everything is based around. I mean, they were very honest and open. I mean, that's what they're taught to be, and they just are. There were some things in it, they would go into so much detail that I didn't even put in the thesis. I almost thought it was too prurient. For example, they weren't allowed to relax in a gentlemanly way, and so that's unbiblical to relax in a gentlemanly way. Right?
So a euphemism for...
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay.
But they couldn't do that.
Oh, right,
So they would pray to have wet dreams. Because that... So that's the level to which this is a counterculture, at least in the more extreme cases.
You had a very interesting discussion with Simon. We've talked with some of the same people, Tom Rosell. I've talked to Godfrey Bloom and
have you?
And Simon Webb was one of them. We had a very good conversation, a bit of conversation with him. We talked about sort of counterculture and the idea of rebelling, and that nowadays the sort of I think you were arguing that in our time, quite often the norm is sort of fairly left-wing and subversive. So the counter to that would to be very conservative.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's turned on its head. Yeah. So I think that in as I've looked at a lot, Jonathan Haidt has this notion of moral foundations, and we have 5 moral foundations because we're pack animals, but in prehistory, in order to pass on your genes as a man, particularly to a lesser extent as a woman, you had to ascend to the top of the pack. Because we know from anthropological research on the Bushmen or whatever that 60% of the men don't have children, because you have harems, you have polygamous marriage systems, and the dominant men, women want the dominant men, and so you have to ascend to the top of the pack. So we have these 5 foundations. We have the group-oriented foundations of in-group loyalty, of obedience to authority, and of sanctity versus disgust, because normally what sanctity basically takes that often that's good for the group and it sanctifies it, and it takes that which is bad for the group and it taboos it. So if you keep out foreigners, you keep out novel diseases and things like this. And then you have the individually oriented foundations, which are more in the interest of those that are lower down the hierarchy, of equality, i.e., everyone has a fair share, so you get more as a person lower down the hierarchy, and harm avoidance, i.e., if you militate against general harm, it's militating against general harm to yourself. We have these 5 foundations, and conservatives tend to be high in interested in all 5 of these foundations, whereas liberals are only interested in the 2, with equality and harm avoidance, i.e. the individually oriented foundations as opposed to the binding foundations. And so what I think happened in Victorian England was, because it went conservative, much more conservative than the Georgian period, for example. And I suspect this was because of the Industrial Revolution, which meant that a lot of diseases became endemic all at the same time. So things like cholera and typhus and whatever, they weren't that common before the Industrial Revolution because we were all living in villages. So they all became endemic at about the same time, and suddenly you had people getting ill and then just dying, at the same day. You didn't have that before. And so they became very, very, the reaction, of course, is to be very high in disgust. And disgust is a conservative value, and so you end up with these people that are incredibly sexually puritanical. And this is so you start off being high in disgust, and then you become a society which is puritanical, and then the more intelligent people, they notice what the dominant value is. They force themselves to imbibe it, and then they competitively signal their adherence to it in order to get status. And so you get then this runaway concern with disgust, and sexual Puritan. Of course, there are other sexual diseases were becoming endemic at that time as well. So things like syphilis, and then you just get this runaway system until you get to a point by the 30s where Sir Cyril Smith, for example, the MP, he would find as a child that they wouldn't serve him in shops because he was illegitimate. And it was somehow felt that by serving him in your shop, the impurity of him could rub off on you. Right? So this runaway system. And then something, I personally think it's partly genetic, but has caused us to go the other way, which is that system then starts to break down by the 50s, where, and then you have, we move into being concerned with equality and harm avoidance much more, and so then you have now runaway individualism, where there's the more intelligent realise the way it's moving. We're not concerned anymore with disgust. We're concerned with equality and harm avoidance, and then you get runaway individualism, and so we get up to this point that we have now, and then that becomes the dominant system. Then you have the people that would rebel in the conservative system would be the left-wing people, the Bloomsbury group, those kinds of people. We had an interview a while ago, didn't we, about the book Churchill's Headmaster, and so the people that were the rebels then, people like E.M. Forster, all that group. And there was that chap, what was his name, that was at Churchill's school, the artist that had a relationship with Virginia Woolf. All of those kinds of people, and then the people that are you then get those that are the super conformists. That push it in an even, who in a sense are rebelling, but not really, that are getting the dominant set of values and pushing it in a more extreme direction, like the church ladies of the time, the extreme Puritans. And now this is turned on its head, and it's the extreme woke people that are that kind of person. And I don't think it's any coincidence that they're women. As Orwell said, it's always the women, because women are high compared to men in social anxiety. Women are very high in social conformity. Women tend to get status covertly, so they because they're physically weak, they don't want to play for status overtly. This gets them into a fight. They could be physically damaged. And also among women, the way that they are adapted, the way they are evolved, is to be parts of harems where you find a small number of allo parents with whom you trust the co-parenting of your children. And so you have to bond with them to a very profound degree, and this means that there has to be a feeling of equality. So that's what women kind of like. And so you get this extreme covert playing for status on their part, where they are uber woke in our time, but 100 years ago, exactly that psychology, i.e. the mentally unstable woman that's very high in social anxiety, would have been the uber conservative church lady that would refuse to serve someone like Cyril Smith. So if you read like Lady Chatterley's Lover, and there's this friend of Lady Chatterley that's absolutely appalled by her behaviour and whatever to do with her, right? Well, that woman now would be the woke extremist, and on the other hand, the rebellious type. If you are genuine, it was a genuine rebellion in the 50s to be pro-gay. I mean, it had genuine consequences. I mean, you would be ostracised. You would lose your job. You would be in trouble. And that rebellious type, of course, now you've gone from being at a school when I was there, which was the fag end of the conservative society, where we had teachers that were born in the 1920s, and they would say, tuck your shirt in and don't use the word fuck and whatever. And these days it would be, don't culturally appropriate your shirt. And dye your hair blue and have your penis cut off and the swear word now, we all know what it is so egregious that if I were it's so unholy that if I were to say it, you'd probably bleep it out. I mean, that's how far it's got. And you did have that with regard to the F word many years ago, that it was when it was first said on television, it was considered absolutely unbelievable.
Yes. It's interesting you mention women there, that quite often, because you also talked to Simon Webber all about the suffragettes and the suffragists and that sort of thing, and how sort of the bit of the psychology about fanaticism, and that it can quite easily be morphed or changed, or you can just sort of almost swap out the actual...
He did a very interesting book on this. I think he's changed the title of it, but I think it was originally called... He's done a very interesting book on the suffragettes and how they were basically they were terrorists. Well, yeah. So they were extreme. I mean, this Emily Davison woman that is lauded for being, oh, isn't she brave? She went under the king's horse and died for died for the votes for women. I mean, she was mental. I mean, she was absolutely insane. And she was probably the typical borderline personality disorder, crazy woman. She went up to someone who looked like David Lloyd George at Aberdeen railway station, hit him with a whip. I mean, she was crazy, and she was therefore suicidal. Suicidality correlates with being, obviously, with being a narcissist, which crosses over with being having borderline personality, and of course with being just seriously mentally unstable. She obviously had a personality disorder, and these kinds of people are attracted to extreme ideas because they have this the world for them is this swirling chaos, this unstable, frightening place where nothing makes sense, and so they are attracted to anything which gives them at any given time a very strong sense of identity and sense of self. But the point is that they're never happy, so that sense is unstable, and so therefore eventually they will start doubting even that sense of self, that identity, and they'll go on to something else. And so for some of them, perhaps the votes, and also they have other negative feelings very strongly, feelings like resentment and anger and whatever. So you can see how it would have been a certain kind of resentful, angry, unhappy, mentally unstable woman that is attracted to votes for women. Also, it would be probably quite masculinized women. I look at this in a book I did called Witches, Feminism and the Fall of the West.
I was going to ask you about witches.
It was. So if you're normally, over history, women have evolved to the patriarchy. The women that were not evolved and to want to be in the patriarchy would be selected out, either through honour killings or through just men not selecting for them. And so then obviously if that was under a system of 50% child mortality, that's what we're selecting for. Very high levels of religiosity, traditional religiosity, which is like 0.6 genetic, very high levels of conservatism, again 0.6 genetic, very high levels of mental stability, 0.5, 0.8 genetic, and physical health. And so you have this bundle then, this fitness factor, where all these things are pleiotripically related. 50% child mortality. Child mortality, 1800, 50%. By 1880, it's 10%. And so obviously there's been this huge rise in the population in mutation. And what we would expect those mutations to be associated with would be deviations from that to which we were adapted, and in that we were massively adapted to be conservative and to be and so on. Then we would expect the mutations to be associated with deviations from that. And one of the deviations is going to be that we are evolved to have high levels of sexual dimorphism, i.e. relatively masculine men, relatively feminine women. And you would expect relatively masculinized women, therefore, to have ideas that were incongruous with the patriarchal system. You would expect them to be basically we are what we would call slow life history strategists. We're adapted to an environment in which it's harsh but stable. And so therefore you slow down and you invest in your offspring and whatever, and you have a small number of sexual partners and you do things later so you can learn about the environment, and you're highly adapted to the environment, and you have to be you have to get into groups to survive, so you have to be mentally stable, you have to be conscientious, you have to get on with people, all this kind of thing. In an easy environment, fast life history strategy, that's to say our environment is easy but unstable, well that's live fast, die young.
Suffragettes were that.
I suggest that they were. Now, what that would mean would be lower levels of pressure, lower levels of evolutionary pressure, and so that means that there's less selection against being mentally ill, less selection against being unpleasant. If anything, there's selection for it, because if it's an unstable ecology, you've got to react quickly to sudden dangers. You've got to be basically sort of psychopathic. You've got to be aggressive. And in an environment like that, in which you live fast, die young, there's no point investing in somebody else because they could just be killed at any moment. There's no point investing in any child; it could be killed at any moment. So the men just pump and dump. And the women are evolved to expect the men to pump and dump, with the result that the women have to be more masculine. The women have to do things that men would otherwise do for them. There's less of a division of labour in that sense. So you're going to get these masculinised women that will therefore have a desire for power, will not want to be dominated.
Or build bombs.
Or whatever. Will be aggressive, will be manlike. And I think, and will be physically ugly as well, masculine. I mean, they commented on this at the time, how ugly suffragettes were. Of course they were. They were masculinized women that no man in his right mind would. And also they were mental and they were aggressive, and so they were attracted to this idea that they would have power and that they would be like men.
Right.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.